The autumn arrived not as a season, but as a creditor, cold and impatient, stripping the last warmth from the streets of the city before September had properly ended. It came in through the gaps beneath doors and rattled the loose panes of the windows in the small flat that Mara Callaway shared with her two oldest friends, or the women she had always called her oldest friends, which, she would later understand, was not precisely the same thing. The flat was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled faintly of cooking oil and damp laundry, and Mara's room was the smallest of the three, the one at the back with the window that faced the grey wall of the neighbouring building rather than the street. She had taken that room without complaint 4 years ago, when they had all moved in together, because Delia had wanted the one with the morning light, and Priya had wanted the one closest to the bathroom, and Mara had wanted, as she so often did, for the people around her to be content. She was good at that, the quiet arrangement of circumstances so that others were comfortable. She was less good at noticing when that quality was being used rather than appreciated. She was 31 years old, and she had spent the better part of a decade making herself useful and invisible in equal measure, and she had come to accept these as simply the terms of her life. She was not, by any conventional reckoning, remarkable. She was of medium height, with dark hair she kept pulled back because it was easier that way, and a face that people consistently described as kind without meaning it as a compliment. She wore, almost always, muted colours: grey cardigans, slate blue scarves, the dove-coloured coat she had owned for 7 years because it had not yet worn through, and there was no particular reason to replace it. She worked as a copy editor for a small publishing house, a job that suited her precisely because it required her to make other people's words better while leaving no trace of herself behind. She was, in the parlance of her world, the dependable one, the sensible one, the one you called when you needed someone to proofread a contract, or remember where you had left your keys, or sit with you in a waiting room when there was no one else. She was not the one men noticed at parties. She was not the one who was called first with news. She was, to those who knew her, entirely reliable and entirely overlooked, and she had long since decided that this was simply the shape of her life, and that shapes did not change. She was wrong about that, but she did not know it yet. The dinner had been Delia's idea, as most things in their flat were Delia's idea, because Delia had a quality that could generously be called magnetism, and less generously be called the absolute certainty that her preferences were the preferences of everyone in the room. Delia was 29, and possessed of a particular radiance that Mara had spent years quietly cataloguing, the kind that had nothing to do with beauty precisely, though Delia was beautiful in the way of a painting in a gallery, luminous, composed, unmistakably meant to be looked at. She wore her hair down in dark, glossy waves, and spent more on a single dress than Mara spent on groceries in a month, and she moved through the world with the settled confidence of a woman who had never once doubted that she deserved to take up space. Men fell into her orbit with a helpless inevitability, and she selected among them with the pleasant, unhurried deliberation of someone choosing fruit at a market. Priya was a variation on this theme, glossy and warm and quick to laugh, the sort of laughter that made a room feel lighter, though Mara had sometimes noticed, very quietly and never aloud, that Priya's attention had a ceiling, that it rose exactly to the height of her own enjoyment and no further. These two women were, by all appearances, Mara's closest companions. They had known her for 12 years. They had held her hair back in her 20s and texted her when they were thinking of her and said, when pressed, that they didn't know what they would do without her. Mara believed them. She was, as has been established, sometimes wrong. The restaurant was called Orurin, which had no particular meaning, but had a great deal of visual presence, all pale marble and low amber lighting, and a menu that listed prices in small numerals as though apologizing for them. Delia had chosen it because a man she was interested in had mentioned it was the kind of place one was supposed to have been to, and Delia's approach to cultural aspiration was thorough and immediate. They took their table at 8, and within 20 minutes it was clear that this dinner had been arranged less for the pleasure of one another's company and more as a staging ground for a conversation that Delia and Priya had clearly already had with each other. The bottle of wine arrived. Delia had ordered it without looking at the price, which Mara noted with the practiced calm of someone who had noted such things many times before, and the conversation moved in the way that conversations move when two of the three people at a table have an agenda, sideways and circling, never quite arriving, full of glances exchanged over rims of glasses. It was Priya who finally said it, with the particular gentleness of someone who has rehearsed their cruelty into the shape of kindness. She said that she and Delia had been talking, and that they felt, and they hoped Mara would understand, that the flat was perhaps becoming a little crowded, that they had been thinking about next year, that there was a friend of Delia's, a girl named Cressida, who was looking for a place, and that the timing was really quite natural when you considered it. Mara said nothing for a moment. She set down her fork, which she had been holding though the food had not yet arrived, and she looked at the pale marble table, and at the small numerals on the menu, and at the low amber light, and she understood with a clarity that was almost physical that she was being asked to leave. Not unkindly, not with any particular malice, or at least none that Priya or Delia would have recognized as such. Simply with the clean efficiency of people for whom she had been useful and who had now identified someone more interesting to be useful to them. She had learned long ago that tears were exactly what they wanted, not out of cruelty precisely, but because tears would have made this a scene, and a scene would have had to be responded to, and she had already intuited, in the way one intuits things one has long known without admitting to knowing, that neither of them wanted to respond to her. So she did not cry. She said very quietly that she understood. She asked, because it was her nature to ask, whether they would like to stay for the main course, or whether they would be going. She would later not remember which of them answered or what they said. She would remember only the moment, some 40 minutes later, when the bill arrived, and she looked up from her water glass and found that she was sitting alone. They had gone. Delia first, then Priya, following with the slightly apologetic haste of someone who knows they are doing a wrong thing and has decided the fastest path through it is the best one, without settling the bill, without saying goodbye with any real ceremony. Delia had left 40 in cash, which covered perhaps a third of her share of the wine. Priya had left nothing at all. Mara sat with the leather billfold in front of her and looked at it for a long moment, and the arithmetic was not complicated, and the sum was considerable, and she had precisely that amount in her account until the end of the month. She could pay it. She would simply not eat particularly well for the next 3 weeks. She was calculating this with the quiet pragmatism that governed most of her inner life when the maitre d' appeared at the edge of her vision with an expression she could not immediately read, and said in a lowered voice that there were some vehicles outside, that she had been asked, his word, asked, if she would come. That he paused and chose his next word with visible care. The party waiting for her had said she would understand. She did not understand. She understood nothing at all. But she went because there was nothing else in the room that required her to stay, and because her coat was near the door, and because she was, at her core, a practical woman, and practicality has its own kind of courage. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The street outside Orurin was not, under ordinary circumstances, a street that attracted attention. It was a city street, slightly damp from an earlier drizzle, lined with the moderate plane trees that lined all such streets, lit by the amber overflow of restaurant windows and the indifferent white of the street lamps. It was not a street on which you would expect to find 10 vehicles, 10 large, black, identical SUVs, moving in a formation so precise and unhurried that they seemed to rearrange the street itself around them, claiming it with the quiet authority of things that were not accustomed to being questioned. Mara stood on the pavement outside the restaurant door and looked at them the way one looks at something that has not yet fully resolved into reality, and she counted them. She counted them twice. There were 10. There were men in dark clothing at measured intervals along the pavement, not aggressive, not displaying anything that could be called menace, but with a stillness that was its own form of authority, the stillness of people who were very good at what they did, and very certain of where they were. One of them, tall, composed, with the particular blankness of expression that belonged to people professionally required to have no expression, stepped forward and said her name. Her full name, Mara Callaway. Not a question. He said it like something that had been confirmed through channels. She said yes, because what else does one say when one's full name is spoken with that quality of certainty by a man in a dark suit on a damp city street, beside 10 black vehicles? He said that His Royal Highness Prince Edmund of the House of Cavendris would be grateful for a moment of her time, if she was willing. The words came out level and practiced, as though this was a request that had been made before, and had always been met with compliance. Mara thought of the bill she had just paid. She thought of the £40 Delia had left like a tip at the end of a relationship. She thought of Cressida, whoever Cressida was, who would have the room with the morning light. Then the rear door of the third vehicle, not the first, she noted, the third, opened, and she stopped thinking about anything else. He was not what she had expected a prince to look like, which was a thought she would have been embarrassed to admit to having had, because what had she expected precisely? A crown, a velvet cape, the distant glow of inherited grace. What she saw instead was a man. A tall man, in a dark coat that fit with the understated precision of something very expensive, who unfolded himself from the vehicle with an economy of movement that suggested he was accustomed to small spaces and large ones equally, and who stood on the damp pavement and looked at her across 10 feet of city air with eyes the colour of winter. Not grey, precisely, but the particular shade of sky that comes just before snow, when the light goes flat and the world holds its breath. He had a face that had been described, she would later read, as severe. It was a word she would not have chosen. Severe implied the absence of something. What his face had was not absence but discipline, the look of a man who had learned, through long practice, to keep the interior of himself unreachable. He was perhaps 37. He had not smiled. He was looking at her with an attention so complete and unguarded that she had the sudden, disorienting sensation of being read, not assessed, not measured in the way of men who look at women in restaurants, but genuinely read, like text of real consequence. She held very still. It seemed the only appropriate response. He said in a voice that was quieter than she had expected for a man of his bearing, that he was sorry to have intercepted her evening. She said, before she could consider whether it was the right thing to say, that her evening had already concluded rather definitively. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It was not a smile. It was not quite a smile. It was the almost of one, a brief, involuntary softening that he recovered from quickly, like a man who had not meant to show his hand. He said he had hoped she might join him for a moment. He gestured very slightly towards the vehicle. She looked at it. She looked at him. She thought of 12 years of making herself useful and invisible, and of £40 on a marble table, and of the room at the back with the window that faced a grey wall. She said yes. She would wonder later what she had been thinking. The honest answer was that she had not been thinking at all. She had simply been, for the first time in a very long time, curious about what came next. The interior of the vehicle was very quiet and very warm, and smelled faintly of leather and something she could not name, some combination of cold air and wood and the neutrality of great expense. He sat across from her in the facing seat, and the door closed, and the convoy did not move, and in the stillness of that sealed space she became aware that the quality of his attention had not changed. He was still looking at her as though she were something that required careful consideration. She asked, because she was who she was, what precisely she was there for. He said that was a fair question. He said he had seen her that afternoon. She did not immediately understand. He said he had been at a function that afternoon, a private viewing at a gallery on Ashton Street, the kind of function that was not formally his preference, but was attended as a matter of diplomatic requirement, and that he had observed her there, though she had not, he thought, observed him. Mara thought back through the afternoon with the careful triage of someone reconstructing a scene. The gallery. The Ashton Street gallery with the small sculpture exhibition she had attended on her lunch break, because the publishing house shared a building with the gallery's administrative offices, and attendance had been encouraged, and she had gone because she was, as ever, accommodating. She had spent 40 minutes there, mostly alone, because her colleagues had left early, and she had lingered because one of the sculptures, a small bronze of a figure with its head bowed, had moved her in a way she could not entirely explain, and did not have anyone to explain it to. She said she remembered the gallery. He said that what he had observed in the gallery was this. She had stood for 11 minutes in front of a sculpture that most of the attending guests had passed in under 30 seconds. She had not spoken to anyone because there was no one she was performing for. She had touched very lightly the placard beside the work. She had put her own hand briefly to her sternum just once, the unconscious gesture of a person who has felt something real. And then a woman? He described Delia with a precision that suggested he had not forgotten, had arrived at her elbow and said something that had made Mara immediately compose her face and put away whatever she had been feeling, as though the feeling were something she was not entitled to in company. He said he had found that interesting. Mara looked at him across the warm interior of the vehicle and felt something shift in her chest, not dramatically, not with any particular ceremony, but with the quiet certainty of a thing that has been waiting to move and has finally found the sufficient reason. She said she was not sure what to do with that information. He said that was, again, a fair response, and then he told her why he was in the city, and what the difficulty was, and what, if she was willing, and only if, he thought might serve as a solution to it. The difficulty, set plainly, was this. Prince Edmund Aldrich Cavendris was the second son of a monarch whose health had been declining for 2 years in ways that had not been publicly confirmed and were therefore the subject of relentless private speculation among people who stood to be affected by its outcome. His elder brother, the heir presumptive, had been married for 6 years. Edmund, as the second son, had been permitted the latitude that second sons historically receive, latitude that had, in his case, been filled not with dissipation, but with a particular brand of austere usefulness, running a charitable foundation, serving 2 terms in a peacekeeping advisory capacity, becoming the kind of royal figure who appeared at serious functions and left without making news. He had not married. He had not, in any way that had been observed by the people who observed such things, been close to marrying. There had been a woman once, he said this briefly without elaboration, and Mara did not ask, and after her there had not been another, and the years had passed in the way years pass when a person has decided, not consciously, but through the accumulated weight of small decisions, to live at a certain remove from the things that could hurt them. But there was now a summit, a ceremonial gathering of heads of state and their families, to take place in 6 weeks, at which his mother the Queen had expressed, through the intermediary of her private secretary, the very strong wish that Edmund appear as a settled man. Not an engaged man, not yet, but a man who was clearly in the process of becoming settled, a man who had someone. The expectation had been manufactured and the clock was real, and the difficulty was that the only woman who had been proposed by the relevant parties as a potential companion for this particular purpose was a woman named Celestine Hartwell, who was very beautiful and very well connected, and about whom Edmund said only that she was not someone he wished to spend 6 weeks in close proximity to if there was any conceivable alternative. He had been in the city for a meeting. He had attended the gallery as a requirement. And he had watched Mara Callaway stand in front of a bronze sculpture and feel something real. And he had thought, he paused here, and the pause had weight, that he would rather spend 6 weeks in close proximity to someone who could do that than to someone who couldn't. He asked if she would be willing to accompany him to the estate in Oldenmir, where his family would gather for the weeks leading up to the summit. He said he understood it was an extraordinary request. He said he would ensure she suffered no professional consequence, and that there would be a full account provided to her of what would and would not be required. He said, and here the voice dropped slightly, lost its formality by the width of a single half-step, that he thought she might find it of interest, that it was a very old house, that there was a garden that needed considerable attention, that the library was exceptional. She looked at him for a long moment in the quiet and the warmth and the dark of the vehicle, with the city moving past outside as though it were a film being shown on a screen that concerned neither of them, and she thought about the flat with the room at the back and the window facing grey and the 3 weeks of thin eating and the 40 pounds on the marble table. Then she thought about the sculpture and the feeling she had put away because there was no one to feel it for. She said yes. She said it simply, without qualification, because the truth was simple. For the first time in a very long time, someone had come looking for her. Word reached Delia Marsh before midnight, because words of that particular weight travel at speed in the circuits of people who pay close attention to such things. It reached her through the friend of a friend who had seen the convoy from a second-floor window above Orurin and had taken photographs, and then through a contact who had made a call, and then through the specific, cresting horror of recognition, the black vehicles, the pavement, the woman in the dove-coloured coat, that arrived while Delia was sitting in the flat they had shared, in the room with the morning light, eating the leftovers she had boxed from the restaurant. She set down the fork. She looked at the photographs for a long time. She would not see Mara again for 5 weeks, and by then the world would have moved so far that the distance between where they had each stood would be unmeasurable by any instrument she possessed. But that was later. That night she only sat and looked at the photographs and felt the first cold draught of something she did not have a name for, which was the sensation of having made a very significant miscalculation. Mara, meanwhile, was being driven through the city in the third vehicle of a convoy of 10, sitting across from a prince who had winter in his eyes and almost a smile at the corner of his mouth, with a single bag packed from the flat she had left behind, and no clear picture of what came next, and, for the first time in memory, no anxiety about the not knowing. She watched the city lights move past the darkened window, and thought, with the steady practicality that was her native register, that whatever came next, at least she was going toward something rather than being left behind in it. The estate at Oldenmir was 4 hours from the city by car, and she saw it first in the grey of early morning, when the convoy turned through stone gates set into a stone wall that went on longer than she could see in either direction, and then along a gravel drive lined with trees that had been planted, she would later learn, 200 years before either of them was born. The house emerged from the morning fog with the slow inevitability of something that had always been there and intended to remain. Enormous, pale stone, many-windowed, built in an era when the point of a house was to demonstrate that its builders understood permanence. It had not, she could see even in the fog, been lived in with any warmth for some time. The grounds were tended but formal, clipped and correct in the way of things that are maintained out of obligation rather than love. One of the long garden beds nearest the house contained rose plants that had been pruned to the point of severity, and in the grey light looked more like a warning than a garden. The staff who met them at the entrance were correct and composed, and looked at Mara with the carefully arranged blankness of people who had not been told what to make of her, and had decided to make nothing until further instructed. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Aldrich, no relation, with a face like good carved wood, and eyes that had seen a great deal and chosen to comment on very little of it, led Mara to a room on the second floor that was beautiful and very cold, the kind of cold that comes not from poor insulation but from long disuse. There were dust covers on 2 of the chairs. There was a fireplace that had not been laid. There were 4 windows overlooking the pale, fog-covered garden, and Mara stood at one of them and looked out at the rose beds for a long moment, and then turned and began, with the methodical efficiency that was the innermost expression of her character, to unpack her bag. She did not call anyone. There was, she understood, no one to call. She set her books on the writing table by the window, and her grey cardigan on the back of the chair, and her small framed photograph of her parents. Dead now, both of them, the loss quiet and old enough to have settled into the texture of her. On the windowsill, and she made the room as much hers as a room that cold could be made, and then she went downstairs to learn the house. She learned it the way she learned everything, through careful, patient attention. She learned the names of the staff on the first day, not as a performance of graciousness, but because they interested her genuinely. The housekeeper, Mrs. Aldrich, who had been in the house for 22 years, and whose respect was a thing that had to be earned in small deposits over time. The young maid Saoirse, who was 19 and curious and had a quality of warm good humour she had not yet learned to disguise. The gardener Pell, who was perhaps 60 and said almost nothing to anyone, but had, Mara noticed, the finest hands she had ever seen, large and soil-dark, and very still at rest, the hands of a man who understood what he was doing, and did not need to discuss it. She learned that the dining room contained a table 22 feet long, and that it was set each evening at one end for 2, so that Edmund and Mara ate at opposite ends of a great pale expanse of mahogany, and had to speak loudly to be heard across it, which meant they said very little, because the house had the quality of spaces that have been silent for so long that sound feels intrusive. She learned that the east wing was locked, and that no one mentioned the east wing. She learned that Edmund rose at 5, and that he ran, regardless of weather, and that he returned composed and slightly warmer in the face, but otherwise unchanged, and that he had breakfast alone and worked until noon, and appeared at lunch with the careful neutrality of a man who had organized his days around tasks rather than people for long enough that the habit was now the man. She learned that his almost smile appeared, in those early days, approximately once every 2 days on average, and that it appeared most reliably when she said something plain and accurate that punctured a social pretense, which she did not do intentionally, but simply because social pretenses required energy she preferred to spend on other things. The house, she thought, was like its owner, enormous and cold and built for another era, and requiring, beneath all of that, something it would not ask for. She was not yet sure what she intended to do about that, but she began, as she always began, with what was nearest to hand. The fire in her room she learned to lay herself, because she did not like to ask Saoirse to come up each morning when Saoirse had sufficient other demands on her time. The dust covers on the chairs she folded and put in the wardrobe, because the chairs were comfortable, and there was no sense in them sitting covered. The dining table she addressed on the 5th day, when she came down to lunch and found Edmund already seated at his end, and considered the 22 feet between them, and said, without particular preamble, that she thought the table was too long. He looked at her across its expanse. She said that if it was all the same to him, she would prefer to move to the other end. He did not respond immediately. She was already moving, carrying her water glass, her plate, her napkin, to the seat at his right. She set herself up there and looked at him at a distance of 3 feet rather than 22, and said that was better. He looked at her for a moment with something in his face that was not quite the almost smile, but was adjacent to it, something that involved the slight readjustment of a man who has been surprised. He said that no one had ever done that before. She said she found that difficult to believe. He said slowly that she was probably right, and that it was more that no one had thought to. She said that was more likely. They ate lunch 3 feet apart, and the house was still cold, but slightly less so than it had been that morning, and she thought she noticed, though she could not have said precisely how, that the silence between them was a different quality of silence than it had been. The garden she came to on the 9th day, when the fog finally lifted for an afternoon, and she walked the grounds properly for the first time, and found Pell crouching beside the rose-beds with a care that was almost ceremonial, examining each plant with the focused attention of a physician at a bedside. She crouched beside him without asking, because there was nothing to ask, and looked at what he was looking at. The pruned stems, the soil, the early season evidence of whether the plants intended to come back. Pell said nothing for a long time. She said nothing either. Eventually he said, not quite to her but not away from her, that the beds had been his mother's. He did not clarify whose mother. She did not ask. He said they had not bloomed properly in 3 years. She asked what they needed. He told her. She listened in the way she listened to everything, completely, without waiting for her own turn to speak. And the following morning she had Saoirse obtain the correct materials from the village, and she spent the afternoon in the cold beside Pell, working, neither of them speaking very much. And it was the most peaceful she had felt since arriving. She did not know that Edmund, returning from his run by an alternate route than usual, had stopped at the edge of the garden and watched her for perhaps 3 minutes before turning back towards the house. She did not know this because she had not been doing it for him to see. That was, though she did not realize it, the point. The first real conversation came on the 14th night, after dinner. Dinner now at the same end of the table, a convention that had solidified without either of them formally agreeing to it, when the wind picked up, and the lights in the east wing, which should have been empty, were lit. She was in the main drawing-room with a book she was not quite reading, and she looked up at the window and saw the warm squares of light in the locked wing, and when Edmund came in she said, plainly, that there were lights in the east wing. He looked at the window. His face went through a series of adjustments too rapid and too controlled to read. He said there were not. She said, with the mildness of a woman who trusts her own eyes, that there were. He sat down on the other end of the long sofa. They had been moving, by degrees, to either end of the same pieces of furniture, she had noticed, as though proximity was something that could only be approached obliquely. And he was quiet for a long time, and the fire she had learned to lay crackled in the grate, and the wind pressed against the windows. And then he said that his wife had used the east wing. She waited. He said, his late wife. He said it was not something he had spoken of publicly. He said she had died 4 years before in a manner that had been made to appear unremarkable. A brief illness, the official statement, and that the truth of it was rather different and rather heavier, and was the primary reason for the locked wing and the cold house. And, he said, with a flatness that was the most honest thing she had heard from him, himself. He said he had become accustomed to the cold. He said he was no longer sure it was good for him, but that it had the advantage of consistency. She looked at him across the sofa with the fire between them, and she thought of the bronze sculpture in the gallery, and the feeling she had put away because there was no one to feel it for, and she said that she was very sorry. Not elaborately, not with the performance of sympathy that people sometimes make of grief's proximity, simply that she was sorry. He looked at her, and what was in his face in that moment was something she would not have a word for several days afterward, and the word, when it came to her, was relief. She said his name. Edmund. Not Your Highness, which she had been careful with. Not Prince Edmund, which he had told her on the second day to stop using. Edmund. It was the first time she had used it without the formal context of a direct reply, and saying it felt momentous somehow, like a key turning in a lock, like a door that had been closed for a very long time, opening onto a room that was cold, but not permanently so. He said her name in return. Just Mara. The house held the moment for a breath, and then the wind shifted, and the fire crackled, and they were just two people on a long sofa, and the moment passed as such moments pass, like water closing over a stone. But the stone was there. She had felt it. Celestine Hartwell arrived 3 days before the summit as part of a social gathering that included 6 other guests, courtiers and family friends and political adjacencies, and she arrived the way Delia had always entered rooms, as though the room had been constructed for the purpose of containing her. She was 27, and she was extraordinarily lovely in the way of a particular kind of loveliness that knows it is being observed and performs accordingly. She wore jewel colors and moved with the fluid surety of a woman who has been told her entire life that where she is where things are happening, and she had within 10 minutes of arrival assessed the situation with a thoroughness that was almost impressive, and arrived at a conclusion that was visible in the way she stood nearest to Edmund at every available opportunity, and in the way her eyes moved to Mara precisely once, briefly, and then moved away the way eyes move away from things of no particular consequence. Mara had seen this before. She had been on the receiving end of this particular form of erasure many times, and she had developed, over the years, a kind of immunity to it. Not an indifference, exactly, because she was not a person for whom these things did not register, but a practiced self-containment, the capacity to feel the diminishment and not be diminished by it. She wore that evening the grey dress she had brought from the flat, perfectly respectable, perfectly invisible, precisely what Celestine would have predicted she wore. She said almost nothing at dinner, because dinner with 8 people required a kind of performance she did not have the appetite for, and she watched instead, as she always watched, and she noticed that Edmund looked at Celestine the way one looks at an obligation one has been informed of and intends to meet without particular enthusiasm, and that he looked at Mara the way— She stopped herself. She was not in the habit of cataloguing the ways people looked at her. She had, historically, not found it a productive exercise. She went to bed early and lay awake in the cold room she had made warm, and looked at the ceiling and thought about the summit in 3 days, and the conversation on the sofa, and the feeling she had stopped having enough practice, feeling to be able to name with confidence. The fabrication arrived, as fabrications do, at the worst possible moment. It was the morning of the summit's formal reception, and the gossip had already travelled 3 degrees of connection before it reached the room where Mara was having breakfast alone. It travelled via a lady of the court named Daphne, who had been at school with Celestine, and who owed Celestine a social debt, through a man named George Whitmore, who was pleasant and weak, and had lost enough at cards to Celestine's brother to be persuadable, and it arrived in the form of a story. That Mara Callaway, the woman the prince had brought to Oldenmir under curious circumstances, had in fact come to the estate under some form of arrangement, that she had, before the gallery and the convoy and the cold house, sold her story to a particular publication for a sum that had been clearly specified in the rumour. The story was specific in the way that fabrications must be specific to be believed, and it travelled fast, and by the time Mara came downstairs at 9:30, it had already been discussed in 3 of the estate's common rooms. She did not know it yet. She discovered it in the way one discovers such things. Through the way a room changes when you walk into it, the small recalibration of conversations, The one person who looks at you with the particular blankness of someone who has just heard something and is deciding whether to believe it. It was Sorsha who told her, quietly, in the corridor. Sorsha with her warm humour gone flat with concern, pressing a folded piece of paper into her hands. George Whitmore had shown someone the message. The message was there in her hands. She read it once, and then again, and then she folded it and put it in the pocket of her dove-coloured coat. She stood in the corridor for 10 seconds. 1 second, 2, 3, 4, 5. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears were exactly what they wanted. She straightened her coat and walked toward the sound of voices. The reception room was full, 20 or 30 people, the summit's attending guests, all the formal machinery of the occasion present in the room's arrangement, and the quality of its light and the specific attention everyone in it was paying to everyone else. Celestine was near the centre, luminous in deep emerald, talking to a cluster of courtiers with the ease of a woman who has never had to work for a room. Edmund was across from her, at the far end, saying something to an older man in an undertone, and Mara came in through the left-hand door and stood at the edge, as she had always stood at edges, and waited. She had put the note in the pocket of her coat, and she had her hand in that pocket now, and she was thinking, very carefully and very clearly, about what she intended to say, and to whom, and in what order. And then the room shifted. She was not sure what caused it, some change in the quality of attention, some current that moves through a gathering of people when a certain convergence of awareness occurs. But she felt the room shift, and she looked up, and Edmund was no longer at the far end. He was crossing the room. He was moving through it with the same economy that characterized everything about him, not quickly, not with any performance of urgency, but with the absolute certainty of a man who knows precisely where he is going, past Celestine, who turned as he passed with an expression that crossed toward surprise, past the cluster of courtiers, past the older man who watched with a slight raise of his chin that might have been approval, and he stopped in front of Mara, in the corner where she had been standing, and he looked at her. She said quietly that there was something he needed to know. He said he already knew. She looked at him. He said that George Whitmore was, as of an hour ago, a man whose gambling debts were held by the estate's attorneys, and who had been informed of this fact very clearly, and that the story would not travel further than it had already travelled. He said this without raising his voice, without particular heat, with the flat precision of a man who has done what needed doing and considers the matter closed. The room was not quiet, but it had the quality of a room in which many people were paying very careful attention while appearing not to. Celestine, 10 feet away, had gone very still. He said, and the quality of his voice changed, dropped by exactly 1 register into something that was not a performance but its opposite, that he had something he needed her to know, that he had come to Oldenmir because it was necessary, that he had asked her, at first, because she had stood for 11 minutes in front of a sculpture, and felt something real and put it away, and he had recognized that because he had been doing it for 4 years. He said that he had asked her to come as a matter of convenience, and that he was asking her now as something else entirely. He said, and here the room went as quiet as a room of 30 people can go, which is not silent but is close, that he had not chosen her because she was available. He had not chosen her because she was convenient or pragmatic or any of the other cold words that circumstances had dressed the thing in. He had chosen her because she was honest when dishonesty would have been easier, because she had shortened a table without asking for permission, because she had crouched in a cold garden beside an old man and listened about roses without needing it to be about her, because she had said she was sorry and meant it, and said his name and meant that too. He said the estate was full of people who had been looking at him for 20 years and seen a title and a position and a problem to be managed, and she was the first person in 4 years who had looked at him and simply seen a man who needed the fire laid. He was not asking her to stay because she was useful. He was asking her to stay because— And he stopped, and the room waited, and Celestine was quite pale now, and the older man with the raised chin had the very particular expression of someone witnessing something they had not expected to be moved by, and finding themselves moved, because he was fairly certain that he could not, any more, endure the alternative. There was a long silence. Mara looked at him in the full light of the reception room, with 20 or 30 people watching, and thought of edges, of all the edges she had stood at, of all the centres she had watched from a careful distance. She said, very quietly, that the dining table had been her idea. He said he remembered. She said she would need her own shelf in the library. He said it was already arranged. She said she would like to come back to the garden in the spring, when the roses were ready. He said, and it was not almost a smile, not this time. It was the thing itself, full and unguarded and transforming his winter face into something she had not seen before, something warm, that there would be no going back, only continuing forward. She looked at him for 1 second, 2, 3, and then she smiled too, and it was not the careful, contained smile of a woman managing herself in company. It was the other kind, the kind she had been keeping for when it was finally warranted. Celestine Hartwell left Oldenmir the following morning with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has calculated her position and found it untenable. Mara did not watch her go, not out of triumph, but out of the simple fact that she had other things to look at. She would think of Celestine, in later years, with the particular softness of feeling one reserves for people whose cruelties came primarily from fear of being overlooked, of not being chosen, of discovering that radiance was not, in the end, the thing that mattered most. It was not a comfortable position to be that afraid. She did not wish it on anyone. George Whitmore received a letter from the estate's attorneys, and was not seen at such gatherings again, and the world was neither better nor worse for his diminishment, only more accurately arranged. The reception room, by the afternoon, had resumed its ordinary life, and the summit concluded, and the guests departed, and the house at Oldenmir was quiet again. But it was a different quality of quiet than before, the quiet of a space that has been inhabited with real feeling, and retains the warmth of it even when the particular moment has passed. 1 year later, the roses in the East Garden bloomed for the first time in 4 years. Pell stood beside the first opened flower with the expression of a man who had expected this result, and was vindicated by it without requiring anyone to acknowledge the fact. The east wing had been unlocked, not demolished, not erased, but opened, cleaned, and allowed to breathe, which was, Edmund had said quietly to Mara one evening, the only correct way to treat a room that held something important. The long dining table had been replaced with a shorter one, round, actually, because Mara had said that she had always found round tables more honest, and Edmund had found this observation so characteristic that he had arranged the new table within the week. The library had a shelf with her name on a small card, her particular organizational system, by mood rather than author, which Edmund had found baffling, and then, over the course of a winter, come to understand, visible in its arrangement. There was a child, new, small, given to regarding the world with an expression of solemn inquiry that bore a striking resemblance to its father, and a quality of unruffled practicality that could only have come from its mother. Mrs. Aldrich, whose respect had been given in the careful increments of a woman who gave it rarely, had told Mara directly that the house was better. She had said this not warmly but accurately, which from Mrs. Aldrich amounted to the same thing. Sorcia had laughed more in the past year than in the 3 before it, which was its own kind of evidence. The house was warmer, the fires were laid. The windows in the east wing let in the morning light. Mara stood in the garden with her hands in the pockets of her coat, the dove-coloured one, still because it had not yet worn through, and there was no reason to replace a thing that still served its purpose, and looked at the bloomed roses and thought of a bronze figure with its head bowed, and the feeling she had almost put away forever. Edmund came to stand beside her without ceremony. He looked at the roses. He looked at her. He said nothing because there was nothing that the moment required him to say. She leaned slightly, just slightly, against his shoulder, and the garden held them the way good gardens hold people, with the uncomplicated generosity of things that have been tended and are therefore capable of giving. The autumn would come again, as it always came, but it would arrive this year not as a creditor but as a season, with all the ordinary beauty that implied. It had not been luck that found her. He had simply, in the end, been paying attention. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.